I would like to remain anonymous. Many of you are not going to believe this experience of mine, and I accept that. But this is something that has haunted me for nearly 30 years. No matter how many times I keep telling myself that I was just a kid, and there's nothing I could have done, it doesn't seem to help at all. This took place in the early 90s, in my small New England hometown. I grew up there with my best friend Jacob. Our town was near the Canadian border, in one of the most remote regions of the United States. We lived there because my father worked for a factory that was located in Canada. I don't think most kids today could survive in that kind of environment. Well, let's just say that if you weren't into the outdoors, you would be bored out of your mind up there. Fortunately, Jacob and I were your typical outdoorsmen. Weekends were spent sledding, hiking, fishing, and canoeing. Whenever my family wanted to go do something together, we usually took weekend trips down to Burlington, or we'd go visit my grandparents in New Hampshire. One day, me and Jake were hiking through a forest that was located next to our neighborhood. It was early fall, so there was a light drizzle of snow on the ground, which was nothing compared to the amount of snow we got during the winter months. Since Jake and I were very young, we would often allow our imaginations to run wild when we were out there. We had to make our way through an area where some trees had fallen into each other, which created this sort of natural sanctuary that resembled a cave, which we called the Devil's Throat. Past the fallen trees was a small lake, which we nicknamed the Lake of the Dead. Beyond that was a maze of thick, towering pine trees, the Forest of Lost Souls. It amuses me that I can still remember all of these landmarks. It was like we created our own little world out there. On this particular day, we dared to venture further than we ever had before. The Forest of Lost Souls was a cutoff point for us, as we didn't know our way around past that point. Jake brought some neon green tree markers with him, and suggested that we find out what was beyond the pine trees. We both were adamant that if we found another lake, we would name it the Lake of Life. When we reached the pine trees, Jake began to tie the green markers to the trees every 10 yards or so, always making sure that each subsequent marker was within sight of the last. We made it about 50 yards into the Forest of Lost Souls when we came upon something that I can only describe as a crater in the earth. I'll try my best to give a good description. The trees suddenly stopped at a slope that dropped off. At the bottom of this depression was what appeared to be the entrance to a small cave. Upon seeing this, me and Jake got super excited. We had found something better than a second lake. Since the sun was beginning its descent, we decided that we would explore this cave another time, but first, we had to give it a name. We decided on Skeleton Cave. I remembered staring at the mouth of the cave and getting this cold feeling in my stomach. Even though I couldn't see anything, it was as if something in the cave was staring back at me. Several days later, we followed the tree markings back to the cave's entrance. This time, we brought flashlights with us. We carefully made our way down the slope and stopped at the cave's entrance briefly to make sure the flashlights were working properly. We then entered the dark mouth of the cave. Upon entry, that cold feeling enveloped me once more, but Jake was too excited to be feeling any sense of unease. We came across some interesting rock formations as we made our way further inside, until we eventually reached a dead end. I couldn't really tell you how deep this cave was, but we went on for about 15 minutes before we could go on no further. Jake and I were talking about what we should name the rock formations, when suddenly, Jake caught his foot on something. We both shined our flashlights to Jake's left foot, and were met with something that was beyond reason. I had to take a break writing this because I started second-guessing myself. Should I really put this out there? I don't know if anyone hearing my story will get anything out of this, other than entertainment. After taking several shots of whiskey, I came to the conclusion that I should just go for it. Anyways, back to the story. So Jake caught his foot on something and we both shined our flashlights to see what it was. There was what appeared to be a snake coiled around Jake's ankle. At least, it looked like a snake, but it seemed to have hair. Jake screamed as he was pulled backward into the dark. I stood there, petrified, with the flashlight by my side, listening to the screams of Jake. I'm gonna have to take another shot of whiskey before continuing. My 11-year-old self was paralyzed by absolute fear. However, I did raise my flashlight to see what was in front of me. Jake was dangling upside down in midair, flailing his arms about wildly. My flashlight beam was partially obscured by Jake's hanging body, but I did catch the glimpse of a pair of angry, glowing eyes. Jake was lifted further into the air before he was slammed onto his face. I just stood there, witnessing the horrifying occurrence play out. Jake was still alive and was making this awful gurgling sound. As he lifted his head, I saw his broken face before he let out a muffled scream as the dark mass lifted him into the air again. That's when I dropped my flashlight and took off. I could still hear Jake screaming, "Help me!" I ran all the way back to my parents' house and immediately told my dad about what happened. Both Jake's parents and the police were called, and a search party was put together. While that was taking place, Mom sat by my side as I explained to the police officer what happened. Now, I did tell the police officer the truth in a general sense. We went into the cave, and something grabbed him, and I ran out of the cave and left him behind. I withheld the snake-like thing I saw wrapped around his ankle, and the dark figure with angry eyes. After about an hour, the remains of Jake were found. I didn't find out until many years later. His body was mangled almost beyond recognition. I don't remember much after that. I was sent to stay with my grandparents for a couple of weeks, until the situation blew over. I would eventually go back to my parents, and we moved out of my hometown, closer to the city. I've never seen or heard from Jake's family ever again. There were several follow-up interviews with the police, and they even brought in a child psychologist to get the full story out of me. I can't really remember that whole process too well, but my mother ended up going to court to put a stop to the interrogations. With the investigation hitting a dead end, Jake's death was never officially determined. I think the police suspected that I killed Jake, but had no evidence to support that theory, so they were fishing for some kind of confession. And that's when things got ugly. I also think this is the real reason we left that town. I've put this whole thing behind me for the most part. To this day, I still have reoccurring nightmares. In the dream, I'm running through Skeleton Cave, listening to the screams of Jake behind me. I would always have this overwhelming urge to turn around. But every time I do, I wake up, screaming. This happened to me a few years ago. I live in Canada, and am big into hunting and outdoor activities. In my country, the deer hunting season has started. I called up my buddy Kyle and asked him if he wanted to head out for the weekend to some land that he owns. 2 miles of forest with a river about half a mile in. The only way to make your way around this land is by ATV. So we packed up my truck and trailer and left. And of course, we picked up 2 cases of beer on the way. We got to his land at around 5 p.m., unloaded our gear into the small quad trailer, and set out across the river to our scouting spot. After about an hour, we found a good place to set up camp. After we made a fire, we sat down and made some burgers for dinner. At this point, it was already 10 p.m. After a few beers, I got up because I couldn't find my phone. So I walked over to the ATVs to look around. As I'm searching for my phone, I hear this ear-piercing scream coming from about 50 yards away from my position. It sounded inhuman. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. I heard a gunshot, and I turned back to Kyle. "Why the fuck are you shooting?" "I swear to God, man, I saw something in the trees. It wasn't human. It wasn't fucking human. The loud scream came again, sending chills up our backs. We stayed up for hours after that, and I still couldn't find my phone. A little after 2:30 a.m., Kyle fell asleep, and shortly after, I did too. A short while later, I was awoken by that fucking scream. I had reached my limit. I took a big flashlight, armed myself, and walked further into the forest. I got to a point that was on the edge of a small clearing and scanned the area with my flashlight. I saw something crouching down. When I focused in on it, the thing stood up. This creature had to be at least 8 feet tall. It had these long arms that dangled off the sides of its emaciated body. It looked straight at me with these pale, dead eyes. I tried to move, but I couldn't. It threw its head back and let out another horrible shriek. And I dropped my fucking flashlight and ran back to the camp. I heard the creature crashing through the trees, chasing after me. Kyle was still sleeping, so I yelled at him to wake the fuck up. He jumped out of his sleeping bag as soon as I turned around and fired the rifle into the forest. I heard a cry of pain and frantic footsteps heading back into the trees. I either got lucky and hit it, or I scared it off. We left all of our supplies and jumped onto our ATVs and got the hell out of Dodge. As we crossed the river, we saw something laying on the opposite side. As we drew closer to it, we discovered it was a mutilated deer carcass riddled with bite marks. Its head was missing. We got back to the truck and floored it out of there, leaving our ATVs behind. On the way back to Kyle's house, neither of us said a word about what just happened. By the time we got back, the sun was slowly starting to come out. He fell asleep pretty fast, but all I could do was stare up at the ceiling, thinking about what that thing was in the forest, its haunting screams echoing in my head. I shudder to think about what would have happened to us if I didn't wake up when I did. We might have ended up like that deer. I haven't been able to sleep well since this happened. It's been 4 days, and neither me or Kyle have gone back to grab our gear and ATVs, but we are planning to do so tomorrow. And I hope to hell that we never encounter that thing again. My name is Caleb Hudson. My YouTube channel is Hudson Hornet. The following is a true experience that I will never forget. For some backstory, this happened in 2015. I live in South Carolina. I've always been a fan of horror movies and being creeped out. The thrill was almost addicting to me back then. My wife would make fun of me because whenever that creepy feeling came over me, my eyes would instinctively begin to water. Being military, I've seen all the ugly and depraved things that humans are capable of, and I've never given much thought to the notion of the Native American creatures known as skinwalkers. Having zero experience with the native tribes and being unaware of stories surrounding these creatures, I would have never imagined that something like that could exist in my world. I have since changed my thinking on this, and I no longer have any doubt in my mind that they are out there. By sharing my experience, I hope I can open your mind and inform you that not every encounter ends with immediate death or bloodshed. Hopefully, by listening to my story, you will react correctly should you ever find yourself in the same predicament that I was in. I live in a somewhat rural area, and my house is on 2 acres of land, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. At the time, I was on mid-shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was the weekend, and I normally stayed awake at night while my family was sleeping, so I didn't have to change my sleeping habits. I was outside working on my truck so that the house would be quiet for all those sleeping. I was listening to some music and cursing at the stubborn bolt I was trying to remove. The area was illuminated by a set of halogen work lights. I had my head stuck into the engine bay of my truck. I can't remember what song I was listening to, but I was singing along, trying to drown out the sound of my ratchet clicking over and over as I turned loose the rusty bolt. I wasn't really paying much attention to anything else. The song faded, and there was a slight pause before the next song started. In this 1 to 2 second break, whether it was conscious or subconscious, I picked up on something. An eerie tingling feeling running down my spine. The next song abruptly started, and I quickly reached up to my phone and paused it. After the music stopped, it happened again. My body was almost vibrating, and my eyes immediately began watering up. I stopped turning the ratchet and instantly froze in place, my head still leaning over into the engine bay. I listened carefully and slowly began to realize that the world around me had gone completely silent. Being 2 to 3 a.m. in late July in the South, you would expect to hear some crickets or some random dogs barking in the distance, maybe the wind blowing through the trees. But there was absolutely no sound, nothing at all. I got the sinking feeling that I was being watched and had to force myself to calm down enough to turn around and confront whatever it could be. I raised my head and I slowly turned, gazing into the utter darkness. I sighed with relief to know that no one was behind me, but that icy feeling and the deafening silence was still there. I had to convince myself that it was all in my head, but I had to look for some type of explanation for what I was experiencing. My work lights made it impossible for me to see anything in the darkness behind them. I grabbed a smaller handheld work light from my tool bag and switched it on to scan the tree line. My eyes were hyper-focused on the beam as I scanned back and forth. I then saw it. Something was looming among the trees. My light reflected a pair of piercing yellow eyes. Startled, I froze again, unable to completely understand what I was looking at. The light in my hand was too weak to make out anything else. Without taking a step or averting my eyes off the ominous eyes, I reached my hand out to my work lights and slowly spun them around. I tried not to blink and held my breath until the beams of light landed on the bush. It revealed the dog sitting behind the bush. I let out a frustrated sigh at the thought of how stupid I was to have been frozen in fear by some random dog. Seeing random dogs in the woods or prowling around your yard is really common in the South. Collar and leash laws are lax in rural areas, meaning that dogs are free to roam at their will. I called out to it, whistling and gesturing for it to go away. The dog didn't move. Confused, my eyes focused on the dog's details. That was when I noticed it's of normal size. It was huge. Sitting behind the bush, I knew that it was at least 4 feet tall. It was tall enough for me to see its head, neck, and most of its chest. It was sporting a coat of what looked like a German Shepherd, with some sort of skin irritation. Its large yellow eyes were haunting, and are now burned into my memory. I slowly began to realize that this wasn't a normal dog. Its face and body looked off. It's hard to explain, but it was like its skin didn't quite line up, like it was distorted in some way. My mind raced, staring into the creature's eyes, not knowing what it could be. My blood turned to ice after realizing how long I had been standing there. It must have been 5 to 10 minutes, and this thing hadn't moved an inch. It never even took a breath. I never saw its tail. To be honest, I don't even know if there was one. My mind spun as my heart rate elevated and my skin began to crawl. I thought that if this thing was going to charge at me, I could do nothing other than scream as it tore me to pieces. I knew that no one was around me, and no one would know what happened to me or what terror I experienced in my last moments. Trying desperately to gather myself, I thought that if I didn't take my eyes off of it, then it wouldn't move. Now I know that this might sound stupid, however I do think that this was the correct course of action. I couldn't take it any longer. I stepped backward, half expecting it to attack me in response. But it didn't. I took another step back as my legs shook uncontrollably, never breaking eye contact. I walked backward until my back literally hit the house. I slid against the side until I got to the door. I slowly grabbed the handle behind my back, backed into the house, then slammed the door shut, locking the handle and deadbolt. I flipped on the light, feeling safe, like when you were a kid and you pulled the covers over your head. I then broke into a million pieces, bursting into tears and sliding down the door, my head falling into my lap. I thanked my lucky stars for not panicking, taking deep breaths and trying to gather myself. From outside, I heard an unearthly, blood-chilling scream. I ran to every door and window in my house, ensuring that everything was shut and locked. My mind was at its breaking point, and I could no longer process anything. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the living room away from the windows, with every light on. I now know that what I saw in the forest that night was a skinwalker. There's no doubt in my mind. I told my wife and my close friend what happened, but I've read that just by talking about them to people you know creates an atmosphere of fear, which will draw them in, so I don't mention or discuss it anymore. It's been years since that night, but every time I go outside after sunset, I can't help but scan the tree line with my flashlight, ever vigilant, but hoping that I never see that thing again. I still live in that same house to this day. If you take nothing else away from my story, know this. 1. Without a doubt, there are things out there that we humans do not understand. And 2, always trust your gut instinct when it tells you that danger is near. And 3, if you see them, stay calm. Do not speak. Breathe slowly. Carefully back away. And never take your eyes off of it. My name is Carlos, and I'm not really sure what category this story falls into. I'd probably say it's a combination of paranormal and creature encounter. I think it's more of the latter, to be honest. I know that not many people are going to believe my story, but I've decided to submit it anyway. Maybe at the very least, somebody can be entertained by it. Anyways, it was a different world back in 2003. I was in my early 20s, single and ready to mingle. I lived in an apartment complex in upstate New York at the time. Every balcony was draped with an American flag because 9/11 was still fresh in everyone's minds. I'm sure most people listening to this who are old enough to remember that era can tell you that America went through a wave of patriotism following the collapse of the Twin Towers. We did have internet back then, but there were no smartphones or dating apps. I remember that one of my friends had this flip phone with a built-in camera, which I thought was the coolest thing ever. Yeah, I'm old. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, I was in my dating phase, and there was this girl I had met at the neighborhood gym. Her name was Melissa. She was 5'9", had green eyes and tan skin that perfectly complemented her blonde hair. I was crazy about her, but I didn't want to come on too strong. So I began with casual conversation, and gradually became more and more flirtatious with her. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it worked for me. Come to find out, Melissa lived in the same apartment complex as me, so I made my move and asked her on a date.
Oh gosh, you seem like a really nice guy. but I just got out of a really bad relationship and I'm not looking to date anyone right now.
My heart sank. But as I said before, I was crazy about this girl, but I had to tread cautiously. Talking to girls that you don't know that well can be a lot like driving through a minefield. Make one wrong move and kaboom, you're finished. I understand, and I'm sorry if I just made things weird, but I had to tell you how I felt because it's been driving me nuts. I ended up being friend-zoned, but I had hoped that we could eventually become something more. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we had similar working hours, and we got off around the same time. There was this big lake at the center of our apartment complex, so we ended up taking these night strolls for a while, talking about our day and whatnot. My feelings for her did eventually come back up, and at the end of that conversation, she wrapped her arms around me and made out with me in front of my truck. I remembered her saying,
"I'll see you next Tuesday,"
before she gave me a smile and walked off. Tuesday rolled around, and she was nowhere to be found. I called her twice and left a voicemail, but I never heard back from her. 3 months passed. I didn't hear from her at all. She had disappeared completely. Of course, I was questioning if I had done anything wrong, but without her returning my phone calls, I had no way of getting to the bottom of it. I remembered thinking that she might have been kidnapped or something, but I didn't see any news reports about a missing 5'9" blonde girl in my area, so I just came to the conclusion that she had simply lost interest in me. I'm not going to lie, I was pretty heartbroken, but after 3 months with no contact, I had to move on with my life. It had been about 7 months since I last saw her, when I received a phone call one night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was half asleep when I answered. Hello?
"Hello, Carlos. It's Melissa."
Melissa's voice was cold and emotionless, like she was reading from a script. Melissa? Where have you been?
"Do you still want me?
What?
Do you still want me, Carlos?"
I honestly don't know. You left without saying a word.
"Can you meet me by the lake in 10 minutes? I'll explain everything. Please, Carlos."
I didn't know what to make of the situation. I was genuinely confused. Regardless of any feelings I had about Melissa, I wanted to know what the hell happened and why she vanished. I quickly put on some clothes, left my apartment, and headed downstairs towards the community lake. From the direction I approached, there was a bench next to the sidewalk with a large oak tree directly behind it. The lake walk closed down at midnight, so all the lights around the lake were turned off. The only thing providing any kind of illumination was a white exterior light mounted to the nearest apartment building on the left. I could see someone sitting on the bench. I suddenly stopped roughly 20 yards from them. Something inside me told me that I was in serious danger. I assumed the person sitting there was Melissa waiting for me, but something wasn't right. It felt like I was being set up. I slowly backed away. The figure suddenly stood up. I could see that it was clearly a woman with blonde hair, but her head began to shake violently from side to side, and her body began to twist and contort, shifting in frantic, unnatural movements. The dark shape then began to crawl towards me at an alarming speed. I wasted no time and hauled ass back to my building and charged up the stairs towards my apartment. I usually locked the door whenever I left my apartment, but this time I had left it unlocked and was able to immediately open it. As I did, I heard something from the bottom of the stairs call out to me.
No, don't go.
It sounded like Melissa's voice, but something was off about it. It was like someone was struggling to imitate her. That's the best way I can describe it. I slammed my door shut, quickly grabbing the gun I kept in my nightstand, and aimed it at the door until morning. After that night, I never heard from Melissa again. I asked around the neighborhood, and no one seemed to know who she was. I even called the place she apparently worked at, and was told that no one named Melissa had ever worked there. It occurred to me that in all of my interactions with Melissa at the gym or on the lake walk, it had always been just me and her. No one ever saw us together. All these years later, this entire ordeal still perplexes me to no end. All I know is that whatever was waiting for me by the lake was inhuman. I probably shouldn't be sharing this story, as technically it's still an open police investigation, but I'll change the names for privacy. I need to get it off my chest. I'm hoping that if I stop bottling up the fear and talk about it, even anonymously, I'll be able to sleep soundly again. In early summer of 2015, my friend Michael invited some friends and I to his place for a bonfire. His parents are loaded and own a massive property with a lake and surrounding woods in Alabama. His parents had just recently purchased a brand new RV and had driven down the long dirt road that led behind their houses to park it by the lake. I suppose they saw it as their lake house. I don't get it. Fucking rich people. Point being that Michael wanted to have a bonfire right outside the RV and have some friends over to drink and listen to music. Aside from Michael and myself, our group included Derek, Jake, and my friend with benefits, Carrie. We were all of drinking age, but just barely, and Jake had actually just turned 21 a few days earlier. We loaded up Mike's car with 2 30-packs, pizza, weed, music, and some other snacks, and everything we would need to start and maintain the fire. We drove down the dirt road to the lake and parked by the RV. It would have been at least a 10-minute walk without the car, and we didn't feel like carrying all the supplies downhill, and we definitely didn't feel like walking back uphill later on. The first few hours was just a blur of booze and weed. We all got hammered and baked, and listened to music while we leapt in and out of the lake, and the guys kept trying to get Carrie to take her top off, which I personally had mixed feelings about. After all the pizza and wings and s'mores were gone, we sat around the fire being dumb southern kids talking about all manner of things we would have never spoken about in front of our parents. Derek was wasted worse than any of us, and stood up and pissed directly into the fire, right in front of all of us. We started screaming and laughing and throwing beer cans at him, and when he was finished, he pointed to the far side of the lake and screamed, "Look, a fucking moose!" We all glanced over, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. Mike called bullshit and claimed that he had never seen a moose on his property before. Derek insisted he could see it and continued to point. I stood up shakily and squinted. I was able to make out a 4-legged animal with antlers against the trees about 40 or so yards away. Honestly, I was so drunk I was probably misreading the distance quite a bit. Out loud I said, "Yeah, I see it too, but I'm not sure it's a moose. Could be a buck." Mike and the others stood up, but none of us could make it out. Derek grabbed his cell phone and said he was going to take a selfie with it. Jake and Mike immediately laughed and told him to do it. I told him it was probably not worth it, because I didn't want him slipping and falling in the lake, as drunk as he was. In retrospect, I don't know if this had anything to do with the events that unfolded. We didn't mention it to the police, but I'll add it here anyway. There came a long, wailing cry from the direction of the woods. None of us could tell exactly where it had originated, but it definitely didn't sound like a moose. I think we were all shaken, but were acting braver than we felt. Mike remarked that he wasn't sure what it was, probably some dying animal, and went back to smoking his blunt and playing a game on his cell phone. Despite the wailing sound, Derek had already begun making his way around the lake to get a picture with the moose. I knew it was a bad idea, and looking back, I really should have stopped him. Carrie was getting frisky though, and kept sliding her hand down the back of my pants. So we went into the RV and started making out on the couch. I'm not sure how long exactly we were in there, but we had just rounded second base and were getting ready to head to the bed when Jake opened the door and told us to stop fucking around and get back out there to help him look for Derek. Carrie and I composed ourselves and came back outside to see Mike about a dozen yards away calling Derek's name. Jake was calling Derek's cell but wasn't getting an answer. I thought, damn it, he may have fallen into the lake. We grabbed some flashlights and made our way together as a group around the lake in the direction Derek had been heading. When we were about halfway around, Mike went one way, Jake went another, and Carrie and I stayed close to the water, looking for any trace of him possibly falling in. Again, in retrospect, we should have taken the situation much more seriously and called Mike's parents, but we were all plastered and not thinking straight. After what felt like 10 minutes, I stopped to piss, and Carrie started complaining about how she was cold. We turned around to head back in the direction of the fire, which we could still see clearly through the trees. I called out to Mike and Jake that we were heading back, but neither of them called back in reply. After another moment is when it happened. To this day, I'll never forget it. I was walking just behind Carrie when I stopped to lean my right hand on a tree and lifted my right sneaker up to remove a pebble or something that had been caught in it. And my flashlight beam drifted when I brought my left hand down. That's when I heard a grunt or a heavy exhale. Which might have been because of the sudden rapid movement of the flashlight, but it definitely wasn't a human sound. It was far too deep. I straightened up and shone my flashlight beam into the woods, and I saw it. It was the moose, and it was staring right at me, but there was blood staining its teeth and dripping down from the fur around its mouth. Just beneath it, lying on the ground, I caught a glimpse of a human's lower body. Then, the unthinkable happened. The moose stood up on its hind legs. Whatever it was not a moose. I remember exactly what I did. I screamed "fuck" as loud as I could and yelled at Carrie to run. I grabbed her arm so hard when I dashed by her I left a bruise. She was freaking out and panicking, having had no idea what I had just seen, and yelling questions at me. But I just kept telling her to run. She tripped and went sprawling forward, and for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, I think I was actually dragging her. But I stopped, helped her back up, and we both kept running. When we reached the bonfire, I turned and saw Jake sprinting out of the woods after us. I kept running past the RV and jumped into the driver's seat of Mike's car. But the keys were not in the ignition. I wasn't about to go searching the camp looking for them. Mike may have had them on him still, and I definitely wasn't going to risk locking myself in the RV. I grabbed Carrie again and sprinted up the hill, Jake following right behind. When we got to the house, we burst through the back door and started screaming that Mike and Derek were dead, to which Mike's parents flipped their shit. They called 911, and Mike's father grabbed his gun and drove his Jeep down the hill. I vomited twice as Carrie cried, and Jake kept frantically screaming that he had found fresh blood. Mike's mother kept yelling at us, demanding to know what we saw, but I couldn't say anything, except, "It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a moose." Long story short, Mike and Derek are still missing to this day. The police arrived, swept the area, and while they did find 2 separate spots on the forest floor where there was fresh blood, they never found any bodies. The cops suspected foul play, of course, and we were the prime suspects. Carrie had bruises on her arm and a twisted ankle. Jake had blood all over his sneakers, and I was sweating profusely with my adrenaline levels through the roof. Not to mention we were all drunk out of our minds. We were all brought in for questioning. I told them I saw some kind of animal squatting over a body, soaked in blood. They asked me if it could have been a guy in a suit, and I suppose that's not impossible, but when I made eye contact with it, I got such an intense feeling of dread and foreboding. I honestly doubt it was human. The eyes seemed to whisper, "You're next." They searched the woods for days and sent divers into the lake. If you live in southern Alabama, you may have heard about the investigation at the time. It was on the news. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges on any of us, so they had to let us go. Though Mike's family and Derek's mother are convinced that we had something to do with it, and to this day are still trying to build a case against us. Carrie and I don't talk anymore, and Jake actually moved out west. I know what you're thinking. I was drunk, stoned, and probably seeing things. And yeah, that is possible. But the fact is that 2 young men disappeared, and they both lost a lot of blood just before they did. I've spent a lot of time staring at the ceiling during my sleepless nights, and after doing some research on the internet, I've come to my own personal conclusion that what I saw was a Wendigo. It's the only explanation that sits right with me. Not that that matters much, because ever since that night, in every dark room and shadow, I feel like I see those eyes staring back at me. Thank you for watching. If you have a story that you would like to share on this channel, please send it to my email, unit522stories@outlook.com. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button when notifications turned on. You can further support my channel by visiting the merch store. A link for that is in the description. You'll be hearing from me soon. Until next time, I'm your Uncle Unit. And as always, never forget.